Have you ever wondered why the man who once begged for your soul suddenly vanished when you finally gave it to him? Why the more deeply you loved him, the faster he seemed to slip through your hands? Stay with me until the end of this video, because once you understand what your love awakened in him, you'll finally stop blaming yourself for the moment he ran. It wasn't that you were too much. It wasn't that you loved too hard. It's that you became something he never expected. A mirror. Not a mirror for his success, not a mirror for his charm, but a mirror for the one thing he had buried so deeply. Even he had forgotten it lived inside him. His shadow. And that is the most forbidden truth Carl Jung ever touched. When you mirrored a man's shadow, when you saw his fear beneath the confidence, his wounds beneath the wit, his unhealed mother ache beneath his detachment, something ancient awakened in him. Not admiration, not gratitude, but terror. Because to be truly seen by a conscious woman is to be stripped bare. You didn't just reflect his potential, you reflected his patterns. You didn't just celebrate his strength, you sat silently with his sadness. You loved him in a way that demanded he face the very parts of himself he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. And the truth is, he wasn't ready. Most men aren't. You see, he didn't want to become whole. He wanted to be adored. He wanted the fantasy of love, not the alchemy of transformation. He wanted you to reflect the man he pretended to be, not the broken boy still searching for validation. But your presence, your depth, your unwavering gaze, it made him feel like a child again. Not in comfort, but in exposure, in helplessness. And so he did what every ego does when it's threatened by truth. He ran. He ghosted. He shut down. He blamed you for being too intense, too emotional, too sensitive. He twisted your insight into criticism, your intuition into paranoia, your devotion into control. But beneath all the excuses was one unspoken truth. You saw him, and he couldn't survive being seen. Jung warned us that the shadow, when left unacknowledged, grows violent, not always in fists or fury, but in avoidance, abandonment, and emotional disconnection. He projected onto you everything he feared in himself: the shame, the guilt, the inadequacy, and then he resented you for holding up the mirror. He told himself he left because of the drama, but he left because of the reflection of who he could be if he chose growth over comfort, the reflection of the inner child still waiting to be fathered, the reflection of the unconscious man pretending to be awake. And yet, there was a moment, wasn't there? A flicker, a pause, a breath in the dark where he softened, where he reached, where you felt his soul tremble against the door of truth. That moment was real, but it wasn't enough. Because love cannot enter a locked psyche, and his was bolted shut with fear. So you were left holding the mirror alone. And perhaps for a while you blamed yourself, wondered if you were too raw, too honest, too revealing. Maybe you shrank, dimmed your light, second-guessed your wisdom. But let this be the moment you remember. His running had nothing to do with your worth. It had everything to do with your power. You became the embodiment of what he feared most, the sacred feminine that doesn't flatter the ego, but dissolves it. And no man can stay in the presence of a woman who dissolves his illusion unless he is ready to awaken. But he wasn't ready to awaken. Not then. Not with you. He chose the dream instead of the mirror, the fantasy over the fire. Because to stand in front of a woman who sees your shadow and does not flinch, who loves you not for your mask, but in spite of what hides behind it, requires a kind of courage most men have never been taught to hold. So he left. He returned to what felt familiar, to the women who laugh at his charm without hearing the hollow behind it, to the world that applauds his strength but never questions his silence. He sought comfort in relationships where his story could stay unexamined, where his patterns would never be mirrored back with such surgical clarity. Because he wasn't looking for healing. He was looking for escape. And you were never built for escape. You were built for truth. The truth of what a man becomes when he finally stops running from himself. The truth of how powerful feminine presence can strip the ego bare and baptize the soul in fire. You weren't trying to control him. You were trying to call him forward. Not with demands, but with depth. But that's the thing most men don't understand until it's too late. Depth is not comfortable. It doesn't stroke the surface. It doesn't praise the illusion or tiptoe around trauma. Depth is demanding. It holds space for all of you and refuses to accept anything less. And that's exactly what your love did. It held him to his highest possibility while still honoring his deepest pain. You touched the brokenness in him so softly, he mistook it for threat, because no one had ever done that before. Not without wanting something in return. But you didn't want to own him. You wanted to witness him. And that terrified him more than control ever could. Because to be witnessed is to be real. And to be real is to be vulnerable. And to be vulnerable is to risk rejection, failure, exposure, everything he has spent his life avoiding, everything the world taught him to hide. Carl Jung spoke of this inner split, the division between the persona we show the world and the shadow we bury beneath it. You met both. You saw both. And you loved through both. And he punished you for it. He punished you by leaving, not because you wounded him, but because you didn't. Because he knew, somewhere in that buried place of intuition, that if he stayed with you, he'd have to become someone else. Not a stranger, but his real self. And that was more terrifying than loneliness. So he walked. Not out of power, but paralysis. Not with resolve, but with regret he refused to name. And still, he checks your light from the distance, quietly, secretly, silently, because a man never forgets the woman who mirrored his soul. Even if he wasn't ready to keep her, her reflection changed him. Her presence etched a crack in his illusion. And sometimes, all it takes is one crack for the light to begin its slow, merciless return. Meanwhile, you began to mistake his leaving for your failing. You thought, maybe I shouldn't have looked so deep. Maybe I should have softened my truth. Maybe I should have reflected less and adored more. No. The woman who sees through does not apologize for vision. The woman who holds mirrors does not become a curtain just to keep a man comfortable in his sleep. You were not too much. You were precise. You were not dramatic. You were divine. And now that he's gone, and your hands are empty, you must ask yourself, were you left? Or did your mirror simply outgrow the man too afraid to stand in it? The truth is, mirrors don't chase. They simply reflect. And once a man walks away from the mirror that shows him his truth, He begins to live among distortions again, where he can pretend his wounds are gone. His rage is noble. His detachment is strength. But deep down, he knows. He knows what he saw in your eyes, and he knows he won't find it again. Because you weren't just a woman, you were a portal. A gateway to the self he's been avoiding his whole life. And portals don't remain open forever. Eventually, the woman who sees through begins to turn her gaze inward. She no longer waits for him to awaken. She begins the sacred process of reclaiming her own reflection, not in his pain, but in her peace. Because a mirror that only reflects another's shadow eventually loses sight of its own light. You begin to realize it wasn't rejection, it was redirection. Not a collapse, but a clearing. You didn't lose love. You made space for the kind of love that won't flinch when you are the one being mirrored. Because you've learned now, true connection cannot survive in avoidance. You can't build intimacy with someone who still needs to hide from themselves. You can't hold both the relationship and the responsibility for someone else's awakening. You were not put here to be a man's unconscious. You were not born to carry projections, to mother the unmothered boy within him, to translate his silence into significance. You were born to be, to see, and to be seen in return. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That is your privilege now. To become the woman who no longer waits to be understood, but understands herself. To no longer beg a man to meet you at your depth, but to live there alone, beautifully, until someone joins you, not to be fixed, not to be saved, but to be witnessed as well. You are not bitter. You are not closed. You are not cold. You are clear. Clear on what love is and what it is not. Love is not disappearing acts when the mirror reveals too much. Love is not punishing the one who sees through you. Love is presence, partnership, a brave unraveling of all the layers we've been told to keep intact. And the man who walked away, he may find comfort in the arms of those who never confront him. He may thrive on the surface, in rooms where his reflection is filtered and flattering. But late at night, in the quiet corners of his solitude, when the performance ends and the persona cracks, he will remember you. Not just for your beauty, not for your body, but for your gaze. The gaze that didn't ask him to pretend. The gaze that called him home. And what he didn't realize then, but will come to understand in time, is that he didn't lose you. He lost the one soul on earth who knew how to love him before he became lovable. The one who saw the diamond still buried under decades of dust. And when he finally begins to dig, you won't be waiting. You'll be walking, not away from him, but toward the woman you became when you finally turned the mirror toward yourself. There is power in the woman who reclaims her mirror, not to reflect the brokenness of others, but to witness the clarity of her own evolution. She no longer dims her perception to keep the peace. She no longer wears softness as a survival skill. She no longer bends herself into a shape that fits a man's undeveloped sense of self. She has become the mirror that reflects only truth, and truth is not for the faint-hearted. This is what he feared all along. Not rejection, not judgment, but transformation. Because once you are seen that deeply, you can never return to the illusion. He ran because he knew, on some soul level, that staying would dismantle the scaffolding of his identity. The charm, the control, the carefully curated distance from his own inner chaos. You didn't hurt him. You activated him. You stirred the storm he was trying to silence. You invited the inner boy to speak, the shadow to breathe, the soul to rise. And instead of rising, he ran. Because rising requires death. The death of the ego. The death of the mask. The death of who he thought he was supposed to be. And you grieved him. But what you were truly mourning was not the loss of a man. It was the death of a possibility, a sacred future that would never unfold, a healing that would never be shared, an awakening that would have required him to meet you in the fire and stay there, naked, shaking, ready. But he wasn't ready. So now, you walk with a new kind of wisdom, the kind that doesn't rush to reveal, that doesn't offer the mirror until it is asked for. You know now that not every soul deserves to be seen by your gaze. Not every man is prepared for the unfiltered truth of a woman who has done her shadow work. And this is the moment of your rebirth. Not in his arms, but in your own. You no longer look back with longing. You look forward with discernment. You no longer confuse intensity for intimacy. You no longer believe that your love alone can lift someone into their potential. Because now you know, only the man who chooses his own evolution is worthy of being mirrored by a woman like you. So if you ever cross paths with him again, and you might, he will look at you differently. Not with the entitlement he once held, but with a reverence born of loss, because he will know what he didn't then, that your kind of love was never ordinary. It was medicine, and he refused the dose. He may try to speak, to explain, to remember, but the woman standing before him now is not the girl who needed his understanding. She is a sovereign mirror, polished by pain, burnished by truth. And she doesn't reflect to be adored. She reflects to awaken. But she also knows when to turn the mirror to the sun and walk away. Because no matter how deep the love was, a woman who chooses her own peace over a man's avoidance is not a tragedy. She is a triumph. She is the very thing he wasn't ready to become. And that will haunt him longer than her absence ever could. There is a haunting in the man who ran from his own reflection, a slow-burning ache that simmers beneath the surface of success and sex and smiles. He may laugh louder now, post more, distract better, but there will always be a quiet moment, usually when the world goes still, when the mirror returns. Not through another woman's gaze, but from within. Because that's the thing about mirrors. Once shattered, the image still remains in fragments. And if he ever dares to gather them, he'll find you in every shard. Not because you broke him, but because he broke himself trying to deny the truth you showed him. You, the woman who knew how to hold both his fire and his fear. You, the woman who didn't run when his darkness surfaced. You, the woman who became unbearable to him, not because you harmed him, but because you refused to let him hide. And now, that refusal becomes your liberation. Because the woman who becomes the mirror and survives being blamed for the reflection emerges with an unshakable knowing. She is not here to make a man whole. She is here to remain whole, with or without him. Carl Jung said, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." You are awake now. You see clearly, not just him, but yourself, your capacity to love without shrinking, your ability to walk away without closing, your fierce tenderness, your sacred boundaries, your earned wisdom. You are no longer the woman who offers her mirror freely. You offer your presence to those who are ready to see and to stay. And if one day the man who fled returns, carrying the pieces of himself he once abandoned, you won't feel vindicated. You won't feel superior. You'll feel still, grounded, beyond need, beyond rescue. Because healing has made you whole, not his return, not his regret, not his realization. Just you, your work, your light, your reclamation. He may look into your eyes and see the same gaze he once feared, but this time, it will not be an invitation. It will be a farewell. Not bitter, not cruel, just final, because the woman who once mirrored his shadow now holds her own reflection, with reverence, with power, with peace, and she no longer waits for a man to become conscious. She simply becomes so conscious that only the worthy can meet her there. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses. If this message stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more soul-deep truths rooted in psychology, power, and feminine awakening.